Hey everybody, welcome back to the shop here at Flat 6 Motorsports. My name's Ivan. Today we have a special treat for you. We're going to be installing Öhlins coilovers on Project Carrera T. Let's get into it. So the Öhlins Road Track coilover kit comes in two different boxes. In the big box, you're going to find the shock absorbers for both the front and the rear. You're also going to include the bellows that covers the shocks. The instruction manuals and owner's manuals and additional hardware is going to be in this bag. You're going to get your adjustment wrenches for both the lock rings and for the preload adjusters. And you're also going to be getting a sticker pack. So that'll be fun. And I'll show you what's in the other box. Now in the smaller box, you're going to have your rear springs and your top hats. You're also going to have your front springs and their top hats. And you have their height adjusters that go on the bottom of the shock absorbers that will adjust your height. You have all the plastic and rubber spring isolators and some additional lock rings for there. So now, once we have all the parts laid out, we're going to show you how to go ahead and assemble each of the shocks before we get them on the car. So before we get the car on the lift, one thing I do recommend doing is coming to the back of the vehicle to remove some of the trim panels so we can gain access to the top of the rear shock mounts. Now there's 3 bolts on each side and a wiring harness that needs to be disconnected. So I'm going to go ahead and start pulling these panels out of the way. Pretty simple to do. For the moment, all you really need is a pry tool. I'll show you how it's done. First, we can just fold down the rear backrests, kind of get those out of the way. Then we take a pry tool. I'm going to pry up around the perimeter of these little plastic pieces. This holds in the rear carpet cover. And they come out just like that. All right. Next, we have a back panel going across from each side of the C-pillar, and that's held in with some just retaining clips that needs to come out, and that'll allow the rest of the carpet to be pulled up. So we can just grip underneath this panel here and just pull out. It's a little snug, like so, and just work your way down left to right, and that'll come straight out, like so. Panel out, nice and gentle. All right, now you have that panel out, you have access to the carpet. Easiest way to take this out, there's no clips or anything other than the ones you already removed. The easiest way is to gently fold it up in the middle, and that way you can kind of work it out from underneath the C-pillar trim panels here and there, like so, or it's not going to harm the carpet. Once you work it out, just kind of keep it in a slightly folded position and just pull it straight out forward. And there you go. Once you have the carpet out, you do have this piece of styrofoam kind of covering some of the modules in the back here, as well as among the few panels. You can just kind of lift that up. There's nothing holding it on. Just kind of tuck it out of the way, remove it from the vehicle. And what that's going to do is give you access to the top of the shock mounts. If you see over here, you have 2 bolts in the front, 1 bolt in the back on each side. And you also have a small wiring harness, and that's connecting the top of the shocks to the rest of the wiring harness for the PASM system. But to disconnect, you can use either a pick tool to pry underneath the little clip here, or you can just use your thumbnail. It's pretty easy. You can just pull up with your thumbnail a little bit while pulling on the harness a little bit. There, snug. And then it just comes right out. You can just set that aside. Once the wiring harnesses are disconnected, grab yourself a 13 millimeter socket, probably a small extension as well, and then you can remove the 3 nuts that are holding on the top mounts to the vehicle. It's okay to loosen up right now. When we lift the vehicle, it's not going to droop all that much. Everything's going to stay in place, but that way we don't have to take the car back down again or do anything of that nature to remove the shocks. So I'll go ahead and grab my tools. We'll get those loosened up. All right, so when loosening these, we're just going to be using a 13 millimeter socket with an extension, and along 3/8. And go ahead and break them loose. You can if you want. You can also use, electric impact gun to get those out. That'll work fine too. If you do use that, definitely recommend ear protection. Gets kind of loud. So we're gonna use that, get the rest of them loose. All right, once everything is removed and loosened and the wire's disconnected, we're now ready to put it on the lift, and then we can start doing either the front or the rear, whichever you want. But those are ready to come out, so we'll do everything else on the lift. Now that we have the car up on the lift, we're gonna go ahead and take off the wheels so we can get access to the suspension behind it, and we'll show you all the components that we're gonna be moving around and removing on the next step. So first things first, we're gonna use a 1/2-inch electric impact with a 19mm socket to go ahead and zip these off, and let's get that done. We're also using wheel guide bolts. Makes it a little bit easier to pull the wheels off. Okay, so with the wheel out of the way, we can now see the components that we're working with here. There are a few things that we need to remove before we can get the strut out of the vehicle. First things first, we're going to take the brake caliper off the rotor. It is secured with 2 T55 Torx screws, so you just need a large like T55 bit, such as this, 3/8 drive, long ratchet. We're gonna get that loose. After we move the brake caliper and hang that out of the way, we do have a couple of sensors that need to be unclipped. Wheel speed sensor needs to be unclipped, and the harness can just be pulled out of its little brackets, and we take that off. Speaking of brackets, there is a bracket that's connected to the brake line, and that uses a 10mm screw. It's just a tiny little screw with 10mm head. That holds that bracket to the wheel carrier. That will also have to be removed so that the brake caliper can sit out of the way. All the brake lines can be cleared, the electricals, all that's clear. Once it's out of the way, we're able to remove the front sway bar end links. The nut up front, which will be removed right here, that is an 18mm nut. You're going to counter on the back side of that with an 18mm wrench. Now I do have a special thin 18mm wrench, so you might have to fabricate with something, or if you have a skinny enough wrench to do that, because that'll hold basically the shaft of the bolt for the end link while you remove the 18mm nut on the front. Once that's out of the way, that's pretty much it for doing that. All right, so now that we have all the parts disconnected and removed off of the wheel carrier, the brake rotor is going to stay on there. We're going to go ahead and lower the car down, and we're going to do the rest near the floor. We're going to use the jack to hold up the wheel carrier And then we're going to undo the top 3 bolts, the 13 millimeter nuts for the strut. And we're going to lower that down as an assembly, pivot it out, and then we'll be able to remove the strut assembly outside of the rear wheel carrier. And then we'll replace everything on the spring compressor. So let's go ahead and get the car down, show you the rest of it. So now that we have all the components removed from the wheel carrier, we're ready to access the top of the struts where they're mounted to the body. So to get access to that, we're going to take this cover out first. It simply lifts up, held in with 2 clips, just like so. Pull it up, and then it pulls straight out from the cowl. And we'll go ahead and move that out of the way. Now, just like the rear, the struts are held in with these 3 nuts. They're all 13 millimeters, and we also have our wiring harness for our PASM right here. Now this harness is actually held in with a bracket, but it's easily removed. Simply just lift up on this little clip right there, fold it out of the way, and then we can pull our wiring harness out of the bracket. Just like before, we can also lift up the little clip with our thumb or a pick, and then pull it straight out. May have a little bit of resistance, there is an O-ring in there. Now with that out of the way, we can get to our 3 bolts. One thing I do recommend doing before you take them out is make a little mark on here so you have a reference for when you put the struts back in place. It will help with the alignment later. But before we take those nuts out, what we're going to do is we're going to place a jack underneath the wheel carrier on the ground to keep that from falling out of the vehicle when we remove the top part. So let's go ahead and get that jack set up and I'll show you it's done. So before we take the 3 nuts that hold the top of the strut to the vehicle, we put a jack underneath the wheel carrier here to support it, kind of keep a little bit of tension on it. So we'll take those nuts out and we'll lower the entire thing down as a unit. And then once it clears the fender, we're going to go ahead and pivot it out and pull the strut out as an assembly. And then we'll get it on the spring compressor and disassemble it. One thing I also want to mention before we pivot it out, I'm going to use some painter's tape to cover the edge of the fender, just in case, because it does get a little bit close, but just for safety, we're going to go ahead and cover that, make sure the paint stays in good shape. All right, now we're ready to take the 3 nuts off the top of the strut, and we'll lower this down. All right, we got the 3 nuts removed from the top of the strut. So we're going to gently lower this down while keeping hand on the strut assembler here, and we're going to guide that down to its lowest possible point. Now that we have the jack lowered down to the lowest possible point, we can now pivot the top of the strut out of the vehicle, and then we'll be able to remove it. And there you have it, simple as that. One thing I do recommend, once you have the strut out, you can just pivot this back up and jack it up just a little bit to kind of keep it in a nice level plane. That way it's not flopping around on the ball joint. Like so. And it's safe to say right there. Now that we have the strut out of the vehicle, let's go ahead and get on the spring compressor. We're going to get this top hat off because we do need that for the Öhlins coilovers. So we'll show you how that's done. So now we have the strut mounted in the spring compressor. So what we're doing with the spring compressor is we're going to be removing the top hat off the original strut. So these coilovers will require the use of the factory top hat. So what we're going to need to do is first we're going to compress the spring to take the tension off the top hat. And then it's secured by this large 21 millimeter nut at the top. So there's a couple of different ways you can remove that. You have to initially break it free and then remove it after that. So for that, we're going to be using an O2 sensor style socket that will be able to break it free. And then you're going to have to hold the center shaft of the shock itself with a 10 millimeter open-ended wrench. So while we're loosening that, we have to hold that in place. So to break it free, so for this instance, we're going to use a 21 millimeter O2 sensor socket, and that's going to do is go on top hat like that. But we're also going to use some large wrench. It really doesn't matter. And what that's going to do is that's going to kind of hold the top hat in position. So while you're trying to, break it free, what this is going to do is going to hold that top hat in place while you do that. Like that. So now you get that first initial break it loose. You don't need that anymore. Now that we broke the top nut loose a little bit, I'm switching over to a smaller ratchet to make it a little bit easier to work around. So again, 21 millimeter. That's going to go on there. And then we'll take our 10 millimeter box end wrench over the wiring harness. And that's going to sit there and hold the shaft in place while we loosen the nut around it. So So you want to twist it. And eventually you'll get to the point where you don't need to hold the shaft anymore. The nut's loose enough. You can just take that off. Like so. All right, so now that we have the nut off, we're going to go ahead and pull the top hat off. It has a couple different parts. So this is the main top hat that's going to be bolted back into the vehicle. It has a couple parts here. Now this part right here, this is the upper spring perch. So we're only going to be saving part of this. So the rubber piece just sits in there. We're going to be taking the rubber piece out. And the metal piece with the little plastic insert, that's going to go back with the top hat. That's going to be saved and be mounted onto the new coilover here. So now that we got it apart, we're going to take this and we're going to use that to assemble the new coilover. All right, to assemble our new coilover, we're going to start by placing our length adjuster into the jaws. That's kind of be our base. Set that right there. That's going to hold it in place. So that is going to do our length adjusting of the shock. Then we're going to take our shock assembly and gently thread it in here. And as we're threading it, we're going to thread it down so that the bottom of the shock just protrudes out the bottom of this, of the length adjuster. And that should get us in the ballpark as far as like the overall length is going to be. And we'll make adjustments once we get it all fully assembled, and then we'll be able to dial in the prelude and the length of the shock assembly. All right, that's probably a good position right there. So you can see the adjuster knob is just coming out of the bottom, and we'll set it right there. And we'll make, like I said, we'll make some adjustments after we get it all assembled. We're also going to make sure that this lock ring and the spring preload adjuster is also loose, so we can make adjustments to that. So next we're going to go ahead and put on our dust boot. The instructions do say we need to trim off 30 millimeters from the end, so went ahead and did that. Cut 30 millimeters off the end of the other one, so we'll go ahead and get that on there. And we'll go ahead and just slide that down. Next we're going to take our plastic ring, and that's going to be for the lower shock mount. It's going to sit just like that. Next we can put our spring on. The spring is going to be designated by a part number, which you can see in the instructions for both front and rear. It tells you which spring you're going to need. This is a 47000-19, and that's going to be for the front. And that slides down just like that. Next is going to be our rubber ring, and what that's going to be doing is going to be sitting on the more shallow of the upper spring mount. Now, there's two in the box. There's a fairly deep one and then a shallow one. The shallow ones are going to be for the front, deep ones are going to be for the rear. So what I like to do is take the rubber one and go ahead and put it up around there. And then we'll set that on top of the shock, or excuse me, the springs, like so. Next we have a spacer, and that's going to go on top of the shock body right there. Take a little space. And lastly, we're going to be putting the OE top mount on top of the spring. If you want, you can assemble as such. You can put the larger piece on top just like that. And that's going to give us our kind of turnability. When you turn the wheel, it lets the shock assembly turn without too much friction. And then we're going to set the top mount on top of that. Now you may or may not have enough of the strut assembly poking out of the top to be able to put the new nut on. So all we're going to be doing is just kind of like lowering this down. So we're going to lower that lock ring down a bit. And then we're going to kind of spin the adjuster down a bit. You can kind of hold that up. All right, so with that lowered a little bit, now we have a good portion of the shock coming through the top hat, enough to get the top nut threaded back on. So the new top luck nut is going to be installed a little bit differently than the OE one came off. Instead of using a 10 millimeter box end wrench to hold the center shaft, we're going to be using a 6 millimeter Allen key that inserts right there. And instead of using a 21 O2 sensor socket to tighten the nut down, we're actually going to be using a 19 millimeter one. And that's going to be torqued to 40 Newton meters. So we're going to start off tightening it down with just a normal ratchet, kind of get that part out of the way. And once we get down to our final tightening, we're going to hook up a torque wrench, and we're also going to be using a just a long, small diameter socket on there just to kind of counter that. All right, she's snug. So go ahead and swap the ratchet out for the torque wrench. All right, got our torque wrench set to 40 Newton meters. And there she is. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and set the preload. Now, obviously we just kind of installed everything loose here, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna basically pre-compress the spring. It comes in a set length as it is from the factory, and we're actually gonna compress that by about 2 millimeters to set a preload of 2 millimeters. So which equates to about 7 inches overall is kind of what the measurement is going to be. So let's take a measurement of like where it's at now. All right, so we're right at about 7, sorry. So right at 7 inches, which is about where the preload needs to be. So that's set right there. So what this ring does is kind of pre-compress that spring to where it needs to be, and that partially affects the ride height, but also keeps the spring from flopping around there when it's decompressed. So now that that height is set, we're gonna just dial up that lock ring. And we're gonna use the provided wrenches to make sure that gets snug into place. So we're gonna use one wrench to hold the top and the other wrench to tighten the bottom. Oh. Okay. And that's just spinning in the length adjuster. So that's all moving as a unit, so that's good. Double check our measurement. So we're measuring from the top of the spring to the bottom of the spring. Yep, right at 7 inches. After we get the preload adjusted, we now have a basis for measurement for the height adjuster. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna measure from the bottom of this lock ring to the top of the length adjuster. So we're measuring this gap right here. So per Öhlins, that's gonna be about 60 millimeters, which equates to about 2 3/8 inches, just in case you don't have a metric ruler. So it looks like we're at about 2.5 right now. So we're gonna bring that down 1/8 of an inch. So this is pretty simple. We're just gonna screw the whole shock body down. Check our measurements. So we got 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, went a little far, 3/8. All right, so we got 2 3/8 there. So the combination of the height adjuster and the preload sets your overall ride height. And like I said, this is just a preliminary function. We're gonna set them all to Öhlins specs. And then once we get it on the car, set it on the ground, we can adjust as needed. We can either increase the preload a little bit to lower it, or play with the height adjuster. It just depends on like what you're working with, and how much room you have to play and how far you wanna go with it. So this would be a good starting point. We're gonna go ahead and get it back on the car and see how it looks. So now we have the front struts assembled, and before we get them in the car, I just want to go over a couple details when comparing them with the OE front strut. A couple things that stand out is obviously it's a much shorter overall length compared to the OE ones. You have your adjustability, your dampening adjuster, at about 28 clicks of adjustment here from full soft to full hard. You also have your height adjuster right here. You can just kind of basically thread that up and down on the body of the shock to adjust the height and the length of the shock, the strut itself. And these are your preload adjusters right here, your lock ring and the actual adjuster. And this will actually, compress the spring or let it out of it. You do have a minimum. It's at the minimum right now of 2 millimeters, but you can compress that further to do minute adjustments of the ride height of the vehicle, which we'll dial in a little bit later. But that's just a couple things I want to point out. The main thing I do want to point out though is that the OE shocks are electronically controlled. Now the new coilovers, since you have all these external adjustabilities, you don't have electronic control anymore. So what we need to do is install the Öhlins cancellation kit, and that'll take care of any error messages or lights like that, because we don't need electronic control anymore. So now that's covered, we'll go ahead and get these installed in the car, and then we'll move on to the rear of the car and we'll show you the differences in that one. All right, we have the shock all assembled. Now we're ready to put her back in the vehicle. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna lower the jack back down, tilt this outward. We're gonna insert the strut into the wheel carrier, pivot it back up, and then use the jack to slowly compress it up until we can get the 3 strut mounts up to the top. Then we're just gonna kind of finger tight all the fasteners on there, and then once we get the car kind of back up in the air, then we'll torque everything down. So for now, we're just going to finger tight all the bolts back into place to make sure everything's in the right position, and then we'll torque it to spec. So let's get to it. One thing I did want to point out, when you're installing the struts, they are labeled left and right, and they do have an indication arrow on pointing to the front of the car, so that way you can get these lined up properly and not have it like backwards, because it does, obviously it does spin. So just make sure your alignment marks are in the proper location. All right, so we do have our 3 top bolts secured. Next, we're going to be putting on the brake caliper. We're going to be using new screws to mount the caliper, so we're just going to be hand tightening them for now and then torque them later, like I said, but always use new screws for your brake calipers. Next, go ahead and put in your little 10mm screw, and what that's doing, that's holding the wire and harness bracket to the wheel carrier. It's a good time to put it in while everything's still kind of loose, because it's kind of hard to line up and very easy to cross thread, so just take your time with it. Once you have that in place, we can now pivot the sway bar end link up and get that in position to thread through the back side of the wheel carrier, and then we can tighten that one down snug but not fully torqued, and that way it'll hold the wheel carrier to the strut assembly itself, and then we'll be able to raise the vehicle off the jack. All right, all the fasteners are snugged up, so we're going to go ahead and just lower the jack down. Everything should stay in place, like so. And then now we're going to lift it up in the air and go ahead and torque all of our fasteners to spec. Now before we lift up the vehicle, we're going to go ahead and torque down the top mounts, the 3 nuts on the top there. They're going to be torqued to 33 Newton meters. There we go. Go ahead and knock out the other side, and then we're going to go ahead and lift it up and do the rest of the bolts underneath. All right, now that we got the top hat secured to the vehicle, we're now going to torque down the last couple fasteners. The 2 fasteners on the brake caliper, we're torquing down to 85 Newton meters. Remember to use new bolts for those. And the other bolt that we're going to tighten down is the sway bar end link bolt, and that pins the wheel carrier to the strut body itself. That's also going to be torqued down to 85 Newton meters. You can reuse the nut on that one as well. So we're going to do the brake calipers first, and then we're going to do the sway bar end link next. Now when you torque down the sway bar end link, you're going to use the 18mm socket, but you also may need the 18mm wrench again just to hold it. Sometimes it moves, sometimes it doesn't, but we're going to use it in this case. Last but not least, we're going to tighten down the little 10mm screw that holds that bracket to the wheel carrier. It's just at 10 Newton meters, so we're just going to use a little 1/4 inch 10mm ratchet. Doesn't need to be torqued down, just 10 Newton meters. It's just kind of good and tight. And that's pretty much it. All right, so now that we have the front suspension all installed, we're going to start on the rears. Now the rears are going to be a little bit more complicated. There's a few extra parts we need to take out, but like the fronts, first things first, wheels are coming off. So the 911 uses a multi-link rear suspension setup, so it differs from the front strut assembly in that the shock is separate from the rest of the control arms and the wheel carrier, as you can see here. So we don't have to take away too much in that sense. But what we do need to take out is the rear sway bar needs to move out of the way. We're going to be taking out the lower control arm bolt and swinging that out of the way. We're also going to be undoing the lower shock mount to the wheel carrier. And once all those components are out of the way, the wheel, since we've already undone the top mount, the shock will just slowly drop out of the vehicle. We'll go ahead and reassemble our coilover and then reinstall in the reverse order. So let's go ahead and start getting these components out of the way, and we'll get that shock out. So we're going to start with the rear control arm, rear lower control arm here. We're going to use a 18mm on the front nut, and we're going to counter with a 16mm on the bolt itself in the back. A trick for this one is to use an electric impact, if you have one, on the 16, and use a little pry tool to kind of pry some outward pressure, and that'll help spin the bolt out of, because there's a lot of material for this bolt to come out with, so we're just gonna flip it out. Like so. Similar to the front, the pivot point for these lower control arms, as you can see, they're kind of stiff and it kind of stays in place. But we need to swing this arm out of the way. So what we're going to do is we're just going to loosen the 18mm nut on this eccentric screw. So go ahead and mark where it's at now. Now you get it back in the ballpark, but again, this car is going to get in alignment afterwards. So we'll just get it back in the ballpark, but we can just loosen it, and that way we'll be able to push this arm out of the way. There we go. Now we're just going to kind of push this out of the way and just kind of snug down that 18. That'll kind of keep it from flopping back and forth and possibly hitting you. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to take off the rear sway bar end link connection here. The end link's going to stay on the wheel carrier, but we need to disconnect the sway bar from the end link. So it's going to be a 16mm on the nut, and we're going to hold it with a T30 Torx bit on the actual stud. So I'm just going to use 16mm ratcheting wrench on that, and then we're going to hold the centerpiece once it comes loose a little bit with a 1/4 inch T30 bit. All right, she's loose, but we don't want to take it all the way off just yet. We're going to get this whole assembly loose and hanging down. This is kind of like our security to hold in place so it doesn't swing out of the way and hit somebody or something. So we're just going to leave it loose on there, kind of as a retainer. We're going to take care of the other side, and then next we're going to do the two 13mm bolts that holds the sway bar bracket onto the lower carrier here. All right, so 2 bolts for the sway bar bushing bracket here is a 13mm. All right, we got this one loose. We're gonna go ahead and loosen up the other bracket and then also loosen up the other end link. And once that's done, we'll be able to swing this down out of the way, and then we can undo the sway bar from the end links by hand one at a time and get the assembly out of the way. All right, everything's loosened, so we're gonna go ahead and drop this sway bar out, letting it pivot on those end links, like so. Sure clears everything.
It's the trigger.
Then we're just gonna take off the end link nuts one by one, work that out, put it back on there for safekeeping, and that way we can kind of pivot the bar out of the way. All right, with the sway bar out of the way, we're now ready to take out the lower shock mount here. We have a T55. We have a T55 on the bolt side, and then we're going to be countering it with a 27mm socket on this side. You can use a socket, you can use a box end wrench, whatever you have available, but that'll hold the nut there, and we'll take it out the front way. It should just come out just like that. Now that we have the lower shock mount bolt out, I want to make a note that if you have a 24 model and newer, you're going to have to continue and take an additional bolt out of the upper control arm to allow a little bit more movement of the wheel carry. Porsche redesigned the lower spring perch in 24 to make it wider, and it's a little more difficult to get out if you don't take that bolt out. If you have a newer or older than 24, you can just take this bolt out and have enough room to pull the shock out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take this top mount out and show you how that's done. Lastly, we're going to disconnect the level sensor from the upper track arm. We're going to pop off that, and then we're going to take out the 10mm screw that holds the bracket in place and just kind of shift that out of the way, and that'll give us clearance to slide the shock assembly out of the vehicle. The best way to disconnect the link is to use a long fork tool, and that'll gently pry it out.
Yes.
Like so. Make sure it's out of the way. And then we have a 10mm screw on the front. And with that, you can just slightly move the assembly off to the side. All right, now that we have both the lower shock mount and the upper control arm bolt out of the way, we're going to gently press up on the brake rotor while also pulling the shock mount out towards the inside of the vehicle. There we go. It's a little fiddly, but just work a little bit and it'll come out. All right, so now that we have the shock out of the vehicle and mount it on the spring compressor, first thing we need to do is go ahead and take that tension off of the top hat here. So we're gonna go ahead and get that spring compressed a little bit. There we go, now we got a little bit of gap there. All right, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and take off this top nut here so we can get this top hat. Because like the front suspension, we're also gonna be reusing the top hats off the rears. All right, to get the top nut off, we're gonna use a 19mm offset wrench and a pair of vice grips to hold the center strut, because it uses a 9mm wrench, but it's very, very tight, so it's really hard for that wrench to hold on to it without it slipping off. So we're just gonna use a pair of vice grips just to break that nut loose, and then we'll go back to the 9mm wrench. There we go. All right, so once you get the top nut off, we're going to go ahead and remove the top mount from the rest of the assembly. Now the top, this is the only part that we're going to be reusing, so we're good with the rest of this. So we're going to get this off the spring compressor and get the new parts on here and get them assembled. So the rear suspension is set up very similarly to the front with a couple minor tweaks with as far as like distance are concerned. So we got the shock mounted up in the compressor. First thing we're going to do is install the plastic lower spring mount. Yep. Next, we're going to do the dust boot, which we've cut down by 62mm or about 2.5 inches. Then we're going to go ahead and install the spring. If you note here, this one is a different part number, so it's a 47010-47. Next, we're going to use the taller of the top hats. Remember, the more shallow one was mounted to the front, so the rears are going to get the taller one. And we've already installed the rubber O-ring upper spring mount. We're going to set that down like so. Next, we're going to test fit our OE top mount. Like I said, the only part we're going to be using is the aluminum part. And that's going to set down right on top of there. Now, it looks like we're just a little bit too tall. The top of the shock mount is not coming through the hole in the top, so we can't get the nut on. So what we're going to do is go ahead and loosen your lock ring on the bottom and your preload, and we're going to go ahead and dial that down the shock body until we can get that top mount to come through. So it looks like we have the majority of our threaded shock body above the mount, so we're going to go ahead and put the nut on. All right, so the rears do come with a separate washer, and they have a slightly different lock nut that goes on it versus the fronts. One other thing to note with the rear suspension, you will need to remove this little circlip from the inside of the shaft. Here it's just above the adjuster, and what that'll allow you to do is insert an Allen key to hold the shaft while you're torquing down the top nut. So this will need to be removed first in order for an Allen key to get a good secure seat in there. So we just use a little pick tool to pick at it and it'll come right out. Once you have the circlip out, you'll be able to insert a 6mm hex to hold the shock shaft, and then you use I'm using a 17mm offset head wrench to go ahead and tighten that down. We're gonna go ahead and get it snug down with the wrench, and then we'll torque it to 30 Nm. So per the manual, the initial setup is going to be 198mm, which equates to about 7 3/4 inches. So we'll go ahead and take our measurement here. And it looks like we can go down a little bit. We're just shy of 7 3/4, so use our wrench. Check the measurements. Yeah. All right, 7 3/4. All right, so that's right where it needs to be. All right, go ahead and spin our lock nut back up again. All right, now that we have the preload adjusted, we're gonna go ahead and adjust our ride height. We got ahead our lock nut a little bit loose, and what we're gonna do is actually just thread the shock out of the lower shock body here to the spec. And the spec we're looking for is 2 7/8, which equates to about 72 millimeters. Let's go ahead and check it real quick. It's about 1.5, so a little bit to go. And you're measuring from the bottom of the upper lock ring to the top of the lower lock ring. Looks like we're about there. And once that's mounted in the car, we'll go ahead and secure these lock rings, just double check our heights. Lastly, before we go ahead and put it back in the vehicle, I'm going to show you guys how to install the adjuster. Now on the front shocks, you have the adjuster at the bottom of the shock body, but because that's a little bit hard to get to on the rear, what they did was they installed the adjuster at the top. Now, this is going to be the adapter essentially, and it's going to screw on to the top of the shock body, like so. Once you screw that on, you can see this clicks as it goes through. So normally, you're not going to be able to reach that because of the rear carpeting. So what they do provide you is this cable assembly with an adjustment knob on it. And the cable assembly locks into place on the adjuster. You can feel it catch in place. Once the cable is installed, you're going to use the provided Allen wrench to secure the pinch bolt. What that'll do is that'll hold the cable in the adjuster, so that way the adjuster, when it's routed inside the cabin, you'll be able to turn and make adjustments. It's not too bad. And you can install the shock just like so. You're just going to thread this up in there, and I'll show you how to do that next. So now we have our new coilover kind of assembled here with the top hat from the original strut mounted to it. I just want to point out a couple differences from the original one. You do have your adjustments for your preload, just like before on the front. So you have your preload adjustment right here, and then you have your lock ring for your height adjustments right here. This is going to be a little bit different in that the height is adjusted by threading the body of the shock into the bottom part. So you loosen that lock ring, and then you can actually just turn it so that the whole shock just gets longer or shorter. Another thing I want to make note of, when you're installing it on the spring compressor, you want to make sure that you clock the top hat with the bottom mount. They do come in, and they come in and out side specific, so you want to make sure that everything is lined up for easier installation when you go back. So that way this will fit onto the wheel carrier in the proper location, and then of course this will bolt into the body in the proper location. And again, we don't have the wire for the PASM. But we are going to have the adjuster running up through the body. We're going to put that on later once the strut's actually into the car, because the knob won't fit through the opening in the vehicle. So we have that assembled separately, and we're going to install that once we get it back into the car. So I'll show that in a minute. So let's go ahead and get this in the car, show you how it's done. Now, before we put the strut back in the body, since it physically has a smaller size than the original one, what we're going to do is we're going to reconnect this upper wishbone to the wheel carrier while it's still kind of loose and we don't have a lot of other things in the way, because we don't need that disconnected now to put the strut back in place. So we're going to get that installed first. All the bolts from now are going to be just threaded in loosely, and we're going to torque everything under load with the pull jack, and I'll show you that in a minute. So let's go ahead and get this bolt in. All right, now that that's loosely secured, we're going to go ahead and thread our strut back up through, lining up the studs with the top. And since it's shorter, it should drop on fairly easily. It helps to have this pull jack kind of keep everything in place and raise and lower as necessary to get everything lined up so you're not straining yourself trying to hold everything up. As for the bottom shock mount, we're going to put in the bolt with the Torx head and the nut on the back side. We're going to thread the Torx from the front towards the back, just like it came out. It does have a raised edge on the nut and on the bolt itself to kind of locate the shock body to the wheel carrier, so make sure that gets in correctly. And again, throw that in by hand. Should kind of self-locate, and that'll hold it in place. Next, we're going to be putting up the sway bar and get that all the way, and then we'll be able to swing these lower wishbones back onto the wheel carrier. The sway bar could be a little bit finicky. You want to go ahead and try and thread on one side onto an end link. Doesn't matter which side. Throw a new nut on, because those do need to be replaced. And then you can work it up kind of loosely on the mounts. Thread on the other end link. Get the new nut on there. And that'll kind of hold itself in place for the moment. If you want to, you can just kind of hand thread a bolt on each side. All right, once the sway bar is mocked up in place, we're going to go ahead and loosen our centrics up and swing our wishbones back onto the wheel carrier. So, this is one of those instances when having a pole jack is handy, because you can kind of put a little bit of tension on, and that'll bring the bottom of the wheel carrier outward to meet the bolt hole for the. So you just kind of eyeball it and see how it lines up. And then this should thread in fairly easily, like so. May also take some finagling with using a pry bar to kind of gently nudge the angle of the wheel carrier and the wishbone to where you need it to drive in the rest of the bolt. Sometimes it helps have a dead blow. Just kind of get it started. There we go. Again, we're leaving these loose for now until we get everything torqued at the same time. So that's that. So now that we have all of our suspension components loosely tightened up and bolted in, what we're going to do is we're going to tighten up our sway bar bracket. So to do that, the bracket is actually kind of attached to the bushing itself. So to make sure it gets lined up properly, we're going to take it off of the end links here so that we can rotate the whole bracket, so now we don't have to worry about it falling down on us. So we have a bolt loosely here on both sides, and we have the end links taken off the end, so now we can freely manipulate the sway bar onto the cross member. So what we're going to do is going to rotate that up on the cross member until it's into the proper location, and then we're going to give all the bolts, snug them all down. Now once the bolts are all snug down, we're going to torque those down to 65 Newton meters, and that'll connect to there. Once that's done, then we'll be able to reconnect the end links to the sway bar once we have the wheels compressed up in position, and then we can tighten down all the other bolts. So we'll go through this one by one. You also want to be careful with the top bolts on the brackets, because on the driver's side, you're very close to one of the turbo oil drain lines, and so with the tall socket, it may interfere with that. And on the other side, you have the ventilation for the PCV system coming into the turbo inlet. So it's a very tight fit, so just be careful which socket you use. All right, so now we have the rear sway bar brackets torqued to spec. They're still not connected yet, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the pole jack to actually compress the wheel carrier into as close as possible position to how the vehicle would sit on the ground. And that way, when we tighten up all of our bolts, it doesn't put the bushings in the wrong position. If you tighten them up with the suspension sagging, as soon as the car sits back on the ground, it'll rotate those bushings and prematurely wear them out. So what you need to do is compress it so that's in, you know, as close as possible to the position the car is going to be while sitting on the ground. So we use the pole jack for that. You can also lower the car down and place floor jacks underneath it and compress the wheel if you're more comfortable with that, or if you don't have a pole jack. So we're just going to do that with the pole jack so you can see all the bolts and what we do, and we'll go over the torque specs for each one of them. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm just kind of judging, eyeballing it, and it looks like the wheels kind of in the place where it's going to be sitting. Our lower control arms are level with the ground, and if you look, our end links can actually just drop right into the rear sway bar. So we're gonna start with the rear sway bar end links. We're gonna use new nuts for that. They're gonna be tightened to 40 Newton meters and then given another 30 degrees tightening. So they are torque to yield, and there's a few other bolts that are torque to yield as well. As with a lot of Porsche bolts, they use torque to yield quite often, so make sure you have a torque wrench that can do torque angle as well. So we're gonna get this started just like we took it off. We're gonna use the 16mm wrench and the T30 to get it kind of snugged up. And once it's snugged up, then we'll be able to put our final torque on it. All right, so we have our torque wrench set to 40 Newton meters. Get that the first initial tightening, and then we'll switch it over to angle and do another 30 degrees. See, it doesn't take much to do that. While it's still in place, we'll go ahead and switch it over to angle. See that? Okay. And slowly rotate it through. There you go. And we'll just repeat that on the other side. Next, we're going to take care of the upper control arm that we took off earlier today. That's going to be torqued down to 60 Newton meters with an additional 90 degrees. That one does not need to be replaced in this instance. All right. 60. And let's do 90 degrees. There we go. All right, next we're going to tackle the lower wishbone to the wheel carrier. Now this bolt and nut do need to be replaced because that's going to be getting torqued to 90 Newton meters and an additional 90 degrees. So it's pretty high torque value, so go ahead and replace that bolt. All right, so this is 90 Newton meters. That. All right, I'll switch it over to 90 degrees. Definitely helps using the 16mm wrench as a counter because, like I said, it does get a little difficult once you start getting into the angles. Now for the lower shock mount, we have the 27mm nut on the one side, and then we have the T55 on the other side. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the T55 on one side to counter and just kind of hold that in place, and then we're going to use a short extension with the 27mm socket to tighten the nut down. And that's going to be torqued to a simple 110, so nothing needs to be replaced on this one. There we go. So lastly, we have the camber bolt right here. It's 18mm. The torque spec is going to be 100 Newton meters. We're going to mostly just snug it down for now since we are getting alignment done, and we don't need to over tighten it because they're just going to be loosening up again. So we're just going to snug it down so it's secure for now, and then it'll be retightened properly once the alignment is complete. One more thing to note, if necessary, if you found you needed to remove the level sensor from the suspension, go ahead and put it back on for this time. It's just 10 Newton meters to hold that bracket back on, and then you can just clip the link arm back to that upper control arm that you took off earlier. All right, so now that all the bolts are torqued in the proper position, we're gonna go ahead and repeat on the other side with the pole jack, and then we'll get her down on the ground and see how she looks. All right guys, we have everything bolted up on the suspension side. Just a note, we normally wouldn't put the wheels back on the car before we attach the suspension on the inside, but for filming purposes, we put the wheels on here. We're still good. If you did everything right underneath, the suspension is not gonna droop so much that it comes undone. But normally we just leave them off until we get inside and tighten everything up. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna lower the car down. We need to roll it back so that way we can show you exactly what's going on the inside for tightening up the top mounts and also installing the adjusters, installing all the trim, and making sure that the adjusters are in a proper place so you can get to them with all the carpet installed. So we're gonna get this on the ground and we'll show you how it's done. All right, so we're back in the car. We have all the shocks installed and we have the vehicle back on the ground. Normally you do this with, the vehicle still up in the air, but we can do it like this. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and thread on our three 13mm nuts onto the top mounts. and get those snugged down, and then we're going to go ahead and torque them down to 33 Newton meters. Once those are installed, we're going to install our adjuster assembly. So these just simply thread in to the top of the shock strut, and it has like a little, and the cable is keyed here. So we're going to thread that on. It's a 17 millimeter nut. It's tightened down to 10 Newton meters, so just to give it a good snug. And then at the end, we have this knob attached to the end of the cable. So when we put our interior back in, we're going to make sure that these are accessible to the interior, so that way you don't have to tear anything apart if you want to make any adjustments to the shock. So let's go ahead and get these snugged down. I'll show you how it goes. That's it. These are fairly long studs, so I'm just going to run it down with the impact, but I'm going to tighten it with the torque wrench. All right, so the top mounts are torqued into place. So now we're going to install our adjusters on the shock rod. All right. If everything's installed correctly, when you twist the knob, you should feel it click each individual position. All right, we'll just set those aside until we get the interior installed. All right, all the suspension pieces are installed. Adjusters are in place. So first thing we're going to be putting back is the styrofoam cover over the fuse box and all that. So we'll get that in place and make sure we're not covering up the adjusters. Put them right there. All right, so that looks like it's about a good place. And that's about where they're going to be coming out between the carpet and kind of play around with them. They're fairly flexible, so you can kind of adjust where you need to. Kind of keep them right there. They'll play around and we can adjust as we work the carpet back in. So let's get the carpet in next, and we'll see if we can find a good spot for that. So just like when we came out with it, we're going to put a small fold in the middle. That way we can kind of bend it in place like so. And we want the ends, the edges of the carpet right here and over on this side to tuck underneath the C-pillar trim. Just be mindful of your adjusters, make sure they're not getting trapped behind. So we'll go ahead and just kind of tuck it underneath. Get a pull in the trim. So it looks like that, so it's nice and even and flush, and then you have the little flap at the back, and that's going to be covered by the back panel. All right, so now's time to kind of make your final adjustments for the adjusters. Seems like the best place for it to come out is right here at the corner where the carpet meets the C-pillar trim right here, if you can see that. I want to come out at the corner. It's kind of a good place where everything meets up. And then go ahead and tuck your carpet down underneath the trim, like so. So everything sits nice and flat. All right, that looks good. Now everything's nice and flush. All right, looks like it just came out. All right, we're gonna go ahead and put our rear panel back in. Next, we're gonna install that back panel that came out. Make sure you have your little plastic rivet that holds the strap in. We're gonna connect that first. So you just basically place it in the hole in the center there, and then push the center piece in, and that'll kind of expand that little rivet and hold that in place. One thing to note, make sure you have all your metal clips in place on all the connections, nothing missing, nothing stuck in the back panel. And then go ahead, like I said, pull them out if you need to. And then also there are 4 locating tabs, 2 on each side, as well as 2 pins on each side. So you need to make sure that all these pins go into each of those locating holes. They should be all in the right place. The carpet kind of keeps it in place, but as you go in, just go straight on, and then apply a little bit of pressure and get those clips to seat. You'll see. So we're gonna go ahead and get our retaining strap in. Okay, so it pops in, and then just push that centerpiece back in, like so. And then we're gonna rotate the panel up, and everything should line up pretty good. A little bit of pressure, and you should hear all the clips go in, like so. All right, looks pretty good. Everything's tight, no rattles. All right, so looks good. The last thing we're gonna be doing is putting the trim pieces on top of the carpet to hold the carpet in. All right, last we have our trim pieces here. They do go in a certain way. The narrow side, there's a wide side and a narrow side. The narrow side goes towards the back. So it helps to kind of spread them out a little bit. So that way you seat the metal bar that goes across. Seat that in the middle first. And then you can kind of push the clips down like so. It's a little fiddly. But there you go. Just kind of slowly work your way around until they seat. And there you have it. So we have our adjusters here. We can still rotate them, still feel the clicks on each side. There we go. And it's nice because once you put the seats up, can't see them. And that's pretty much it. So that concludes the installation portion of the Öhlins Road Track coilover system for the 992 platform. To wrap things up, what we're going to do is take it out for a short test drive. We let the suspension set a little bit, and then we're going to come back in and adjust the ride height as needed, and then we're going to take it in for an alignment. After that, it's off to the races. If you want to get a set of coilovers for yourself, check us out at flat6.com, and we'll see you on the next one.